I want to welcome you all to the first of two keynotes at this conference. And this is someone who I have followed for some years and I think makes really interesting and good contributions I'm a fan. And I think a lot of you sitting here will also be a fan after your keynote. And that is Jack Andersen, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Communication at University of Copenhagen. And his research focuses on how classification practices, especially within digital media, affect the categorization, understanding, and processing of information, individuals and groups in society. So Andersen examines the social, cultural, and political implications of these classification practices, ranging from algorithms to digital archiving. And his research integrates concepts from genre theory, classification theory, cultural techniques, communication and media theory, and cultural and social theory. And that is a perfect keynote to have at this conference that has the theme of infrastructure and interface this year. So without further ado, welcome, Jack.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, with that kind of introduction, I have to say that the heat is on and the pressure is on. This is the first time ever I have to speak to a camera. So we have to recall Marshall McLuhan saying the medium is the message for the next 45 minutes here. And I'll remember all the time to speak into the camera, or at least look at the camera, because as I said, I'm not very used to that. But I'll try to do that. And thank you, Camilla, first of all, for that very kind introduction. I hope I can somehow live up to these very nice words. I'm always happy to travel around to give lectures, and particularly when you're asked to be lectured, that's an honor in itself, and I appreciate that. And I'm also always trying to do something different from what I did last time I did a lecture. So if anyone has been in the room and have seen me before and thinking, oh, he's going to repeat this old verse again, I'm not, because I am getting tired of all that. So I'm trying to tweak my lectures, also, of course, according to audience, according to theme as well. Today, I've been asked to lecture on this book that Joachim Hansen, my colleague at Linnaeus University, and we came out with this year, and we edited, and the book is a result of a collaborative collaboration among researchers from UK, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, maybe some English people in there. I can't remember actually, but it's a book that I have to be honest, we are a bit proud of, because we managed to gather all these people. It's difficult in the sense that people are busy, and we asked also some people we thought would be really busy, but they said yes, and we are very happy to have them in this book. But on a note of that, I'm not gonna give a sales pitch for this book because I'm not very good at that, so I'm not even beginning on doing that. But Camilla asked me to just do a lecture on this book, she said, she wrote to me. And I thought, well, I can do that. And I will to some point. And at other points, I'm not going to do it, because of course, I'm going to take some detours as well across the themes in this book, because it wouldn't be very interesting to sit here for you among the audience and listen to me enumerating chapter 1 to chapter 11. I'm not going to do that. So sorry if you have expected that, but that's not what's going to take place. But I will take some shots at the book, so to speak. First of all, well, this is my agenda. Given my age, I still love to have agendas, just to say to the audience, this is what we can expect at some point. All the slides, they do not have these titles, but they follow this sort of themes all across this lecture. So I'm trying to stick to some keywords in these bullet points. It's a simple agenda, if you ask me, and I love that too. So, well, Camilla said it. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Communication. I've been with them all the way from when it was a library school, and it turned into Department of Information Studies. Then we merged with the Department of Media and was it Media, Cognition and Communication, something. And now we just the Department of Communication. What's not to like? So that's where I'm working today, and I'm very happy with that department. In fact, I'm these blue-eyed scholars that have no critiques of management whatsoever. So I'm just happy to be there. Well, yes, my main research interests right now are these. I'm a bit. I don't use the word philosophically oriented because that demands too much, if you ask me. But I'm theoretically oriented, and I'm theoretically inspired by a whole lot of a body of literature that I'm going to show you in the end. But I've always been involved with working theoretically with concepts, with how you can reframe or reinterpret areas within classification, within genre theory, and so on. And I've been around for some years. So, and the latest I've been very much interested in is cultural techniques. Anyone is, if you know about it, it's coming out of this German tradition, in particular the German tradition. And some of them would say these are hardliners in the sense they're too materialistic, on the material side. But to me, they make a lot of sense when speaking of classification, because cultural techniques is exactly about making distinctions. And that's what classification is all about, almost. Well, enough for me. Enough for me. Look at it. Imagine your everyday. Most of us, many of you may use all these platforms or media. But what they do particular things. They, of course, offer something. But they also, Spotify curates our mood. Google filters our searches. Netflix curates our tastes. What do? They are not just streaming services. They are not just social media making people connecting with each other. They are actually making us visible to each other. They are making us see what others can see about us. So they are very much into this classification game from the very beginning. And in fact, classification is also the reason why they can make money, because of our data, which they gather and they sell to third parties and so on. And they cannot sell that without having classified that data at some point, at some level beforehand. So these, you can, if I told this to my sons or my wife, they would have said, oh, what's the big deal, Jack? What's the big deal? We just use these. And they are free to say so, and they are very right in saying so. But scholarly, we can, of course, zoom in on them. What is really happening here? And what is really happening here is that these platforms, these systems, these so-called media, they make decisions on behalf of us. That means they intervene in our life, they penetrate into our life, they shape our lives on some level or the other. They do that. Let me give you one example. I was discussing, I'm only on Facebook, by the way, and LinkedIn, but that's my amount of social media. But a friend of mine wrote me the other day saying, have you seen this on Facebook that she is writing this or that? I said, no, I haven't. Oh, but you are a friend with that guy, that person, aren't you? Yes, but I still haven't. So what happens here is that obviously my feed is not the same as his feed, because it's heavily curated based on what I did before and what he did before as well. So the stories that came to life were not the same to us. So what should have been a common conversation about some issue, some matter, was not a common theme, because of the very interface on the material side and because of my feed. That was not the same thing. So what has been happening here? Someone has been curating this, for good or bad. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, But I'm just saying, by showing you that this has a consequence of what we are actually able to talk about because of what is visible to us, what is coming up in our faces. So that means we can say as a first initial sentence for this lecture, and it's a sentence, it's a take on the lecture that I'm gonna follow all through, that classification is a heavy political act. That's rule number one. But you may say out there, and I don't agree if you say, come on, Jack, what's the big news here? We all know that. Libraries, archives, museums have for centuries been curating collections of artifacts and items. They have been using guidelines. They have prioritized what should be in the collections, what should be visible at the exhibitions, and so on. They have been in this game for years. So what are you trying to tell us? Well, that is true. That is definitely true. That libraries and archives and all these institutions, they have been in this game for years. They know, and they are quite aware of, that to some extent, they are also making political decisions, even though politically they are not supposed to say they are political, because in the Nordic countries, at least, they are politically funded. So it's not a good thing saying you are political, in particular, not in the political climate in the Western world in these years. So yes, classification has always been political, but something has changed. And you may recognize this picture. I was astonished, and I was laughing when I saw this. This is at the inauguration of Trump earlier this year. And all these guys standing right behind him, or right next to him, I can't remember. And we all know who they are. These are the big tech people, right? These are the people shaping owning our platforms, curating our platforms. Even though Mark Zuckerberg keeps on saying he just wants to make the world a better place. Michael Jackson said that as well. I mean, come on. But these guys, they had changed the world in a certain direction, at least. They're not changed the whole world, and they're not to blame for everything bad in this world. Not at all. But they had changed something. And that something is that today, they have made classification into an infrastructure because of the choices they make, because of the way they're curating, because of what the algorithms are determining who's visible and what is visible to whom. Looking back at my example with my friend asking me to look at Facebook the other day. So this is not the work of librarians or statisticians calculating social groups and their average incomes, and so to speak. These are the work of engineers producing code and producing algorithms hidden and written in a technical language. So what they're actually in the business of is that they make political choices, but disguised as technical decisions. This proves, not in a mathematical sense, but this at least testifies to some extent why classification is still a political act and why it should matter to us at this moment in time. Because classification, as I start on now, works behind the scenes. It's invisible. We search, every time we search, we click, we prompt, we feed the systems that at the same time classify us. These systems are the infrastructure of our current form of societies, of many societies at least. They're not just some social media. In Denmark, we have a discussion. Microsoft should be delivering its software products for schools. And all of a sudden, it turns out, should Microsoft be the good one to do this? Why are we delegating this kind of work to a US company? Of course, that's heavy critique, especially came after Trump. And I'm not pro-contra for Trump. I'm not going into that. I'm just saying, all of a sudden, this was a problem. But why was that a problem? Because of the data they were collecting about us and about our use. So we just don't search. We just don't prompt. We just don't scroll. Every trace is tracked and collected and classified and made into something about us, about our actions, about our involvement with the world. So what we see and what we know is quietly classified. It's not classification up in our faces necessarily. But also this turns out to constitute a hidden layer of modern culture, because it's a layer we're not necessarily in contact with, and it's not necessarily a layer we see. Some of us may know this layer. I bet all of us in this room would say, "Oh, we know that." Yes, we do. But we're also dependent on it to some extent all the time, right? So far we can say classification is not just a technical operation. It is. For many years, I was disregarding that it was a technical at all, but it is a technical operation. But it's also, in our modern form of society, a heavy current social condition for most of us in the world, either as citizens, or as consumers, or just as private citizens. That's a condition for our being, that's a condition for our communication, and for our lives in general. So, having said that, we can move on. I was trying to speak into the theme of this conference, and I was reading the call on the website, and the conference is about infrastructure and interface. I'm not really an interface scholar. I know what an interface is, and I'm not really an infrastructure scholar as well, even though classification is heavily related to infrastructure. But I am taking this quote from the webpage from Greg Balmer, saying, often the goal of interface design is to make technologies invisible, indeed true, blending into the everyday architecture of our lives. Yet, we only interact with digital media based on the physical qualities of our technologies. I completely agree. But on the other hand, you have to be some sort of, this is a theoretical take as well, because people would be on the use side only would say that the physical qualities, they don't have anything to do with that necessarily. This is a heavy medium theory take on media, and even more materialistic take. But if we can elaborate on that concerning classification, we can say, well, as infrastructure, classification is invisible, yes, but as interaction, it is indeed visible to us, because these websites, they offer us things, they afford us, as the saying goes, things to do. We can click, we can download, we can share, we can tag, we can search. All these actions we somehow more or less expect to be present in the digital media we meet in our lives today. Not all of them all the time, but most of them. So there are also actions that are on the face of it are quite neutral, quite innocent, but they are also actions inviting us to do something with this product. In the long run, collecting our data, of course. So it's interaction and it's interface. So here we have a double layer of classification. As infrastructure, it is invisible. As interface, it is indeed very visible. We may not call it classification, but that is what is happening every time we hit a button. So looking at it historically, because this is a long historical trajectory. This is a long historical development. Societies have always, and cultures have always been interested in their people, in their citizens. From churches to census to passports identifying, confirming our national identity, and now to algorithms deducing our gender, our interest, and purchasing power in real time. The church and the census was not in real, they were not doing the ordering in real time. But this is what is happening right now. Classification in real time, constantly, and to some extent, visibly. So what we can so far say about this brief historical outline is that it has gone from a bureaucratic and manual way of classifying people and our actions to an algorithmic, automated, constantly way of classifying us. So far, that's point number 3, bullet number 3, that the logic of classifying is key, central to social organization, no matter what. This is a brief historical survey showing that. So at birth, we used to be registered once, but now we registered and classified over and over due to the actions we do. We may not be classified as male Jack Andersen. I may be classified as something that has been interested in country music, in rock music, but that's a different person. So now the change is that we are classified constantly over and over again, and not only once by birth. That's a change in itself. That's a social change. That's not a technical change only. So far we can say that classification has always been connected with control. Someone has always been interested in classifying us or something on behalf of others. There has always been a certain motive to do that. But again, the new social condition is that it is infrastructural, it's ongoing. It's not only episodic, it's ongoing. And we may not care about that, and we may not really say that doesn't matter, but it happens to the extent we are using digital media. And we are to an extent. We may not be using social media, but Western governments are digitizing their governance, so to speak. So we are always in contact with some sort of digital medium nevertheless. And these governments say, we don't use your data for anything. But of course they do. They're very much interested in that. So that was the historical picture of this. So just to wrap up so far, classification is both a technical practice and a political practice. It structures and understands how we organize the world. When we assign things into categories or people or ideas, we also influence or shape what becomes visible, what becomes searchable, what becomes knowable, what is countable, and something, and what is countable and who counts here. So classification is not just a mirror of society, it actively produces society in its own terms, of course. That's a summary so far. So moving into this book, now I've given this brief outline saying, why does it make sense to say, once again, that classification is a political act, a heavy political act? Why is that so? It's not just some 1970 saying, it's an ongoing thing, actually, that it is political and we have to deal with it in some way or another. And this book, as I talked about initially, we invited some authors out there that we wanted to be part of this 2-day Carlsberg-funded, yes, the beer company, conference in December 2023. And we didn't have a call for papers out. We invited people we wanted to come to Copenhagen and talk. And we gave them some sort of assignment beforehand, because we told them, first of all, well, modern culture is increasingly articulated through and debated as questions of classification. Modern culture is saturated with disputes about who and what belongs to where, who is and who is not included in the gender categories of women and men, who is allowed to utter something on behalf of others, what kind of information is prioritized by algorithm, shall public libraries contain hateful materials or define the limits of the right to expression. These were some of the broad outlines, the broad questions we asked the people that we invited to think about. And it was at that point in time, there was a heavy debate in Denmark. A public library was, one particular public library had I can't remember what's called in English, but they had a queer day. So the queer festival, I think they call it, a public library. And that was taken up by some political parties asking, is this the job of a public library? Well, I don't know, but they did it, right? But what was the basic line here is, I'm not saying whether they justified, but the basic line is just the very question, just the very contestation that the public library did this was to us a question of contesting modern cultural forms and the way cultural institutions were actually communicating about these cultural forms. But that became, in small little Denmark, that became the political event saying, is this the right thing to do? And luckily, the library went on and they had their event, that is. So also, these are the two keynote speakers. We had Eivind Røsak, some of you may know him from the National Library in Norway, and David Beer, my good colleague from the University of York. We chose these two people as keynote, and I'm sorry to say, and yes, they are white, they are men, they're Western men. Blame me, blame no one else, because I did the choice. But we did that because we had read the books and articles by them, and I had used David's work in teaching as well, and it turned out to be successful and it made sense to the students. So I thought we should have him over, talk about these things. Also because Dave is a sociologist, and I didn't bring his book, but he wrote this book 12 years ago called New Media and Popular Culture, The Politics of Circulation. In that book, there were two chapters, in particular, two chapters devoted to classification and tagging. And I was surprised to see that him being a sociologist writing about that, not that classification is foreign to sociology, became, for instance, but the way he approached it was he was heavily relying on Bauker and Starr and their infrastructure thinking. And that was, to me, teaching classification and digital culture at the time. That testified to me that this field is not only crossing professional boundaries, it's also crossing epistemic boundaries all of a sudden. And that's why, to me, he was an interesting person to have over in Copenhagen and talk. And he said yes. And Eivind is mostly known for, by me at least. He's I would consider him a Norwegian intellectual, and he's much inspired by French theory, among other things. But he's also into archival thinking, and that's why we wanted him over as well. And they both did a splendid keynote, and they're both in here, luckily. But also, we wanted them to reflect on the specific focus on the systems, the cultural institutions, and the media technologies that have categorization and classification as their raison d'etre, and how they struggle with modern culture's ideological contestation. I'm not a museum studies guy. I come up from library and information science mainly, and now I've moved into cultural studies, media studies, and so on, or wherever I have moved. That's not the point. But the point is that these institutions, now and then, they seem to struggle with these problems about how modern culture is articulating itself. Whom are they to include all of a sudden? When I entered the hall, the main entrance at the university today, this university, I was met with posters of the Sami people, their languages, and I didn't know they had a free colored flag, true, and they had free languages, national languages. That sort of exhibition wouldn't have been there 15 years ago. That's a change. That's a way of dealing with some part of Norwegian and Swedish culture, and Finnish culture, by the way, right? So that just shows us that this university has also chosen to deal with some part of how modern culture is articulating itself and paying homage, rightly homage, to Sami people. And Eivind actually did talk about that in Copenhagen. So what we wanted to highlight was classification as this contested practice, constantly contested, and shaped by values, ideologies, and institutional histories. not the least, because the institutional histories, they carry weight into how they see and interpret their collections and their exhibitions, if any. So to us, that was interesting, at least. So that was what we asked them to do. And I'll return to some of them here and there later on. But and the result is, of course, this book. It's only 140 pounds on Routledge. It's a good price, also for students. And it came out this summer, I think. But I'm not here to brag or talk about that book, but just to say, if anyone from Carlsberg is in the room, something happened out of that conference. It materialized in a book. So the structure of the book, and I'm not going to painfully going through it. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what is going on. We structured it into 3 sections. 1, the use of technologies in classification work, social and cultural implications. 2, cultural heritage and new materialism. 3, classification as a method and analytical strategy. Of course, these parts were not produced before the actual chapters came in, but we just sort of, we make the decision on behalf of these authors, putting them into these parts, so to speak. And of course, some of them could have been placed elsewhere. Don't ask me about the particular criteria because I can't remember. So and here we have the chapters in all the parts, and you can see here Admira da Silva, Santos Sundström. She is actually just to give an example from the Museum World, going into this Swedish Museum of Museum of World Culture in Sweden, and how they have classified their indigenous collections of known indigenous Brazilian people. And of course, what she showed that the vocabulary, the metadata, was not recognizable to these indigenous people, obviously. So the whole project, actually, what she was writing about was about some sort of counter classification, saying, how do we do that again, that actually pays homage to these people and not homage to the classificatory structures at the particular museum. So here we had a contestation and we had a struggle, we had a dilemma. I'm just giving that as an example. And part 3 is these 3 chapters, all people from the Nordic countries, and you may know Nils and Kim in particular, from Oslo Met. So this book actually examines classification, how it operates in specific contexts, from archives, museums, and libraries to digital platforms and AI systems. Together, they actually show that classification appears as a field of negotiation, as a field of struggle between norms, technologies, and worldviews, and how they collide these. And that's what I think these authors managed to do well in this book. Enough of the book. Some core assumptions. When we wrote the introduction to the book, what would Joachim and I? Well, returning to what I said earlier, assigning someone or something into a category, that's a powerful act. Because that something or that someone did not necessarily ask to be classified. Let me give you an example. My son suffers from epilepsy. He had a surgery last year in Copenhagen, 1 year ago, in fact. And he's classified in the Danish health system with that disease, because he still may carry that disease, even though he had a surgery. But it's very hard for him to get out of that category right now, because along with that disease or psychiatric, he also had a ADD, because usually that comes with epilepsy. But he cannot come out of that category. So that's a very, very heavy. Of course, we can debate, we can negotiate, but it's not a technical decision. So these categories are very strong to us as soon as we put into these categories by someone. Of course, on the example with my son is also a positive example because that gives him access to help and some stuff in the Danish social and educational system, not least. But he's put into that category, and that category is a powerful label of him. So, but that still points to the fact that categorization is a very influential and powerful act to do. Up until I think it was in mid-80s, homosexuality was considered in Denmark as a disease, a psychiatric disease. If people from the homosexual, from the LGBT plus environments didn't have to protest against that, my guess is, would have never changed. And we may say today, and we may laugh at that today, saying, a disease? Come on. But that was the worldview at the time. And if these people hadn't had their struggle for changing that, that would have most likely been that category today. And it was also removed in the 90s from the International Classification of Diseases. And these are not innocent weapons, innocent tools. These are the tools the psychiatric system uses for giving diagnosis and also giving help. That has a consequence for people. So succeeding in removing homosexuality from being a disease or schizophrenic disease into something normal, that has been a struggle. And without that struggle, that was still been in that category. It's an exercise of power, and that relationship is always asymmetrical. Someone chooses to put you or put someone or something in that category. That is a shaping of that thing in itself. So this exercise of power, it also establishes relationships of visibility, of control, and authority. Who determines this category? Who has the saying of this category? Who belongs where? Who counts? And who is visible? That makes a very, very important mark on society, deciding who is visible. I read a biography by a Danish filmmaker. He comes out of the 60s and 70s generation, and you may laugh at Erik Clausen. I don't know if you know him, but in Denmark, he's some sort of social realist filmmaker. And he wrote in his self-biography, and he was asked by the biographer, what is most important to you? And he said, the most important thing to me is to find out who decides who's in the picture. He was pointing to exactly that question. He didn't call it classification, he didn't call it categorization, but he, coming from obviously the political left, was very aware of that someone is making up a picture of the cultural sphere in Denmark, but someone also decides who is in that picture. That's a political act. And he indeed said in that book that he knew it was a political question. So I'm not going here to reiterate political views from the left, but I'm just saying here's something that is at stake in classification as well. So basically, to classify is to draw lines. To draw lines in the earth, to draw lines on a paper or on a whiteboard. That is a classificatory act in itself. And doing that, we also have an idea of who is going to be placed where. How much time do I have, by the way?
Well, depends on whether you want questions.
Well, I always want questions. I will speed up when...
we have to be out of here in 20 minutes.
Okay, I'll speed up. These were the core assumptions. Assigning someone to a category of something is a heavy political act, mind you that. But also, theoretically, we wanted to move away from this dyadic understanding of classification to some sort of triadic, that classification at least involves three fundamental components: the classifier, the classifiers, those who are classified, and the techniques and technologies used in doing that work, in that classification work. That shows, moreover, that classification is relational. It's not about categories, data categories only, if at all. It's about human decisions. It's about technical mediation, and it's about cultural interpretation of who and whom are going to be placed in these categories. It's action, and it's not representation, as some textbooks of classification in library and information science in particular try to present it. It's not that at all. It's an action. It's power. I can skip that because we've been here, talked about the Museum of World Culture. When categories are imposed, they create necessarily also sometimes resistance to the people who are influenced or shaped by these very categories. So far, classification is an active process. It creates order, yes, but also boundaries. Who's in, who's out. It's always tied to norms and values and principles, maybe, articulated or not. And it constitutes what it classifies. And in doing that, it constructs reality. It makes a difference whether your diagnosis is physical or it's a psychic. That has a consequence for your treatment. So it constitutes what it classifies in that sense. But it's also an intervention in social reality. It intervenes in some sort of game, in some sort of political mesh, social and cultural political mesh, if you like. So classification is not just representing, it's by intervening, it's doing something. It's action, once again. And it's power, of course. One side of this. It's very normal and understandable at some point and we have heard read a lot about bias in data, bias in systems, bias in AI, the AI outputs to prompts, bias there. True, these systems are biased, but bias is also a legacy. These systems, classification systems, whether they are AI systems, social media, or just digital media in general, they carry with them traces of the context in which they were produced themselves. So they carry with them the bias. I'm not arguing for deliberate bias. I'm just saying bias is a thing we cannot reduce. Bias is a thing we can become aware about. We cannot sort out that. We may have these nice ambitions about doing that, but it's not going to happen. I'll give you an example. 8 years ago, the Danish Union of Librarians asked me to give I think it was a morning talk about fact-checking. Because all of a sudden, public libraries and the public librarians, they were in the business of fact-checking. Can you imagine that? And I said the very first opening line of that lecture that morning, you are not fact-checkers. And it closed down the conversation totally. Because I asked them, 1, do you really want to be that? 2, what does it take to be a fact-checker? So you claim you can sort the good from the bad? And they were so pissed with me. And I honestly didn't want to provoke them, but I did. But I was just trying to it's a very, very big thing to claim about yourself that you're a fact checker, because that means you can eliminate to some point bias. And you can't. It's a legacy. If it comes, it follows you through. And the AI systems, they reproduce bias at a very large scale, because they not only multiply things, but they do things faster, and they do it constantly as well. But depending on us using them, because they're depending on our prompts. Even though when we are prompting something, we are, so to speak, talking to the large language model. But the large language model is also a product of what we ask them for. So that is it. And us, the clever people in this room, we also have a bias. I'm sorry to say so. But that may not be a bad thing. It's just becoming aware of that. That's the whole issue here, right? So bias is a legacy. And algorithmic systems inherit these legacies, in particular in their training data sets. And we know that by now. Then what was her name from Algorithms of Oppression, that book? Noble, Sophia's Noble. What she showed in that book was exactly this. She showed, it was in the days of Google, when you search for when you use sexual-oriented keywords for a search in Google, up came pictures with girls, not mature women, girls, colored girls, and so on. So these keywords, using them in Google at that time, were loaded with particular ideas about what should be the response to these keywords. And that was the good thing about her book, because it was very, very simple what she did. But the message was a cool message, because she showed exactly this, that Google did not reduce bias. Google just reproduced, in particular, US structures, because these systems are also location-based. So that's another one. I think I have to move on, right? Let's move to the actually taking the last chapter, the last part of the book, that classification. Now I've talked a lot about classification as power, classification as action, as something that is doing something to us or to the people wanting to, or the people someone wants to classify. We can also, that was the ambition at least, turn classification upside down and making it to an analytical lens in itself, to look at, to turn it into a way of seeing and understanding the world. Because if we do that, we all of a sudden see the world of lines, the world of boundaries, the world of exclusion and inclusion. We see classification matters to social ordering. And we uncover by that also the norms and the values of a particular culture. And that was what Sophia Noble actually did in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, by the way. So, because again, classification helps to determine what counts, who counts, relevance, culture, normality. What is normal in a given culture? That is not something a system decides. That is something a given system inherits from society and the cultural forms surrounding that. So by using classification as this analytical grid or lens, if you like, we start to look at structures, at power structures, basically, in society, and not only at bibliographic classification systems. So, last slide, almost. Why does this all matter? Well, one, digital media has transformed the logic of classification. Digital media is real-time classification. Digital media is constantly classifying us. Digital media is classifying our traces, not only my weight, my height, my color of my clothes today. Digital media are following me in real time. That is the change of the classificatory logic, also by tracing and classifying my purchasing habits, so to speak. That's also of interest to some digital media. That actually creates one big question, I would say, and that's a claim, that the central question, the key question for our time is, how does society decide who and what counts? That's a classificatory question. And that's also a reminder to us that classification is not simply to organize knowledge. It organizes life itself. That's a big one. So, the takeaways. Oh, no, the contributions. With this book, we, at the outset, we were modest, but at the end, we were not modest, because we actually thought, well, we wanted to contribute to this conversation, to this research. And now I'm giving examples of books, and you may know Harold Innis, and you may know Louis Mumford's Techniques and Civilization, Elias, The Civilizing Process. All these books having a large grip on society and the transformation and the historical transformation of societies. And some of them speak about classification, some of them speak less about classification, some of them you have to deduce what are the classification issues here. But these are the body of literature that we wanted to contribute to, and we hope that history will tell. So, takeaways. To understand classification is to understand modern society and its power structures. That is the way I began, and that is the way I end this lecture. Thank you.